Thanks very much. Okay, so I was given the vegetation history of South Australia to talk about, which is no mean feat in 12 minutes. So I'm going to do a subset and just talk to you about a couple of things that I think have happened in recent years that really do change the way we look at this. So the vegetation of South Australia today is basically a desert with a small arable fringe. So that might offend most people in the audience, but that's really what we have now, and how did we get there? This is something that the fossil record is really starting to speak to loud and clear now. So I'm going to start with the origin of angiosperms, since that really does define what modern vegetation looks like. And I'm going to talk to you first of all about what we know now about fire history and how critical that is. So this graph is one of many reconstructions of past atmospheric oxygen levels from the present day back to 400 million years ago. We sit on the green line at about 22% currently, but focus on the yellow piece, which is between 25 and 30% atmospheric oxygen. And when the atmospheric oxygen reaches that level, as long as there's an ignition source, everything will burn. So no matter how wet the vegetation is, it burns. It's a very different world. And that's the world that angiosperms came into. And there's a huge amount of evidence now accumulating from the Northern Hemisphere that in that early angiosperm world, the flowering plants were heavily adapted to high fire frequency. And there's charcoal everywhere. And almost all of the early angiosperms that are being found now are charcoal. So it's a remarkable change in our understanding of what early angiosperms looked like. You can see that towards the end of this graph, it does drop down around about 50 million years ago to more or less current levels, and that's important too. So in the Southern Hemisphere, a really critical place is the bit in light blue there, which is known as the Weddelllian Biogeographic Province, effectively southern South America, the Antarctic Peninsula, New Zealand and southeastern Australia. We know that in this place, somewhere, some of the major plant families in the Southern Hemisphere evolved. The Proteaceae, the Casuarinaceae, the Nothofageaceae, possibly the Podocarpaceae in the conifers. It's a really critical place, and the time was somewhere in the late Cretaceous, and that's about as much as we know. And you do that by narrowing it in from both directions, both in space and time. It's really frustrating that we can say no more than that. But nevertheless, that's the critical place, from my point of view, for the Australian vegetation today. Now, just recently we found our first example of late Cretaceous vegetation in Australia. This is my colleague Ray Carpenter and a group of us published this late last year. This is out of a core in Central Australia, and it's the first time we've seen late Cretaceous angiosperms in Australia. And everything shown on that, these are just tiny fragments of leaves, the cuticles of the leaves. They're all Proteaceae on this particular slide. And notice the one in A, that is the whole leaf width, and that scale bar tells you that's about 1 millimetre wide, that leaf. You can see the little white dots you can see there are the stomates. It's got stomates on both leaf surfaces. That means it's growing in open vegetation, so it's a shrubland, open shrubland. If you go down the line there a bit to K and L, we can't separate those from living Banksia, so we think those are Banksia fossils. And obviously there's quite a bit of other Proteaceae there. The rest of the vegetation, we've got sphagnum, we've got lycopods, we have probably Oricariaceae and Podocarpaceae amongst the conifers. There's a cycad, Bowenia. G is a palm cuticle, probably, it's certainly monocot. H and I are monocot pollen grains. J is a Ericaceae tetrad. And critically, K and L are fragments of charcoal that have come out of the sediment as well. There was fire in this environment, and almost certainly what we're looking at is one of the first glimpses of the Southern Hemisphere equivalent of the Northern Hemisphere Cretaceous fire-dominated and angiosperm-dominated ecosystems. This is new for us and very exciting stuff. But it changed, and it changed somewhere around about 50 to 55 million years ago for a lot of reasons. The atmospheric oxygen levels dropped, so the capacity of the vegetation to burn very easily dropped with it. At the same time, you can see, and not consequent on the oxygen dropping, the atmospheric carbon dioxide in the bottom graph there rose quite considerably to levels that are just horrifying from a present-day perspective. 1,000 parts per million plus excuse me, of carbon dioxide leads to a super greenhouse effect. And the impact this had was to increase rainfall dramatically. So oxygen's dropping, rainfall's increasing. This is not a world where fire rules anymore. On top of that, the southern hemisphere plays a particularly interesting role in the way the climate worked. If you look at the map on the left, this is about 35 million years ago. South America and Australia are still connected to Antarctica. You can't have a seaway around Antarctica, an ocean current. And so the ocean currents all go from basically the equator down to high latitudes and back again. That means at the equator, the sun's directly overhead for most of the day. The atmosphere that it's got to go through is small. The water gets very warm at the equator, and that very warm oceanic water then goes down to high latitudes, taking all that heat with it, and so the temperature differential from the equator to the pole is relatively small. There's no Antarctic ice cap. There's a huge amount of warm water at high latitudes, and it just rains all the time. It's very, very wet. And then, of course, Australia and South America separated from Antarctica. You get the circumantarctic current shown on the right, and if the Antarctic ice cap begins to develop, the world changes dramatically. In that world on the left, you have very wet conditions, and you can see that in maps of South Australia showing the paleo drainage patterns. We had some seriously big rivers running through South Australia back at that time, and the vegetation reflects that. So if we have a look at some of our fossils, unfortunately I don't have time to show you a lot of fossils, but here's a couple of fossil leaves from the Golden Grove sediments, and that's Golden Grove as in the northern suburb. There's a big sand quarry out there. These fossils were found in amongst that. The leaf on the left belongs to the Myrtaceae, the leaf on the right from the Proteaceae, and these are leaves out of very complex, very diverse rainforest, which is effectively tropical by today's standards, and again reflects that both the very high rainfall and also the relatively high temperatures, because remember this was 20 degrees further south than we are now, and yet it's effectively tropical rainforest. Another example of us knowing this is extraordinarily wet is that these leaves are all covered in epiphyllous fungus, and this epiphyllous fungus indicates not only that it's wet, but that it's wet all the time. There's no dry season. So this is an extraordinary time for plants, and effectively what we saw in southern Australia was mass rainforest. The nearest living equivalent is probably mid-montane New Guinea, and if you look in the literature over the past 30 or 40 years really, this was the prevailing wisdom. Australia was covered in rainforest at this time. All of the living Australian vegetation had its origins there, and somehow you've got to work out how the two come together. But now we're seeing some signs of something different. In Western Australia at the same time, we're finding examples of fossils like this. The leaf on the left is a fossil Banksia leaf. There's a living Banksia leaf shown next to it, and then another fossil next to that. Not only is that obviously Banksia, but if you home in on the detail of that fossil leaf, and you can see it in figure 4 there, what looks like a series of bumps, those are actually depressions in the leaf surface, and that's where the stomates were. And somewhat remarkably for fossils of that type, if you look at figure 6, you can see under a scanning electron microscope inside those indentations, and the stomates are down inside those sunken areas. A living Banksia leaf is shown immediately above, and a plant will only do that if it is growing in arid conditions. That's an adaptation to preventing water loss, and so at the same time as we had these mega rainforests in parts of southern Australia, there were some other parts where we had quite arid adapted vegetation, and I'd argue probably this is where the fire adapted species also managed to hang out during that particular time. There's lots of other examples. Here's some other Proteaceae, and we have other families as well. And all of these have those characteristic, very deeply embedded stomates on the leaf surface, suggesting they're growing in quite arid adapted conditions. So mostly rainforest, but not entirely, and that's a change from what what you'll still find in most of the literature. So then at the end of this extremely wet period, things started to change again, and there's all kinds of reasons why Australia started drying out. Part of it was that we separated from Antarctica, and the circumantarctic current dried the climate considerably. You had ice forming in Antarctica, rainfall dropped. We also had this phenomenon where there's a subtropical high pressure cell shown there in red, which controls where the summer-winter rainfall boundary is, and it moved northwards faster than Australia did during the last 20 or 30 million years. So on the left there, 20 million years ago, the summer-winter rainfall boundary was south of Australia. So all of Australia had summer rainfall. As we moved through time, southern Australia developed winter-dominated rainfall, and that's critical for plants because they are much happier living in, that's a bit scary, much happier living in summer-dominated rainfall than winter-dominated rainfall when you've got very, very hot, dry summers. And then we see the glacial cycles developing, as you can see towards the end here, massive instability in the climate, but overall a drying trend. We see the rainforest dropping off. That's a pollen diagram, 40 million years at the bottom, the present at the top. You can see the Nothofagus there, which is effectively rainforest, drops away about 15 million years ago, replaced by Myrtaceae, and then later by effectively daisies and grasses. We do see some signs in the living vegetation of relics of this. In Central Australia, you've got palms and cycads. There's been a recent suggestion that these were carried there by humans. Maybe that's true. I'm not totally convinced that that's the case, but we'll see how that plays out. We also have things like this. This is a tree kangaroo fossil. There's 2 species of them described by Gavin Prideaux at Flinders. 700,000 years old in the middle of the Nullarbor Plain. Tree kangaroos need trees. The Nullarbor Plain doesn't have any trees. So if you look in the botanical literature, there are many wise people who tell you the Nullarbor Plain is millions of years old. They are wrong. It is not. It just can't be. And so there's still a lot we need to find out, and we've got a very scant fossil record for the last few hundred thousand years. So to summarise, early angiosperms in southern Australia were probably adapted to both fire and low nutrients in the Cretaceous. Rainfall rose around 50 million years ago, and rainforests became extensive. That carried on until about 35 million years ago. But even when that was happening, we had significant refugia for fire-adapted species. Then rainfall became more seasonal, it declined totally, and eventually it became quite unreliable. The summer-winter rainfall boundary moved north, and that impacted heavily on southern Australia. Also, temperatures changed, and most importantly, the temperature extremes increased in both directions. That's because the climate was drying. You took all the humidity out of the atmosphere, which is a buffer. And as a result of those climate changes, fire increased in significance, and the old Cretaceous fire-adapted taxa were resurgent. They came back in and started to dominate again. But the important point is the driver for fire was different. In the Cretaceous, it was high oxygen levels. More recently, it's dry climate. So even though the same plants, I think, are doing it, they're doing it for a different reason. But we were looking for them in the wrong place. They weren't sitting in the rainforests. And finally, we still know frustratingly little about the impact of the arrival of humans into Australia. I can't resist this, and I am a botanist, so I can't resist having a shot. Despite all the speculation about the decline of the megafauna, the answer lies with the plants, and we still have work to do in that. Thank you.